Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Cardano and its native token ADA. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, we're going to start off just by looking at the risk level on ADA. We will then branch out to looking more specifically at ADA USD, ADA Bitcoin, and ADA ETH. Obviously, for ADA Bitcoin, for the last 3 years, I said that it would likely bottom out around 400 sats. I think it got to around 470. So I know it seemed like, going to the 400 sat range always seemed like an unlikely outcome to a lot of people, but that was in fact the eventual outcome. So it's kind of interesting how similar this whole thing has been to last cycle. So let's try to figure out where in the cycle are we, right? So for Cardano, again, the current risk is 0.679. Now, to really figure out what that looks like compared to the last cycle, let's take the color out of it and just look at the risk for ADA. Okay, so we're going to go over here. We're going to pull up the risk for ADA, and you can see that the risk right now in December of 2024 looks similar to where it was in December of 2020, right? It's kind of interesting, right? Same, more or less, as it was in December of 2020. And there's some interesting aspect about ADA, how it does tend to repeat this cyclical pattern, but it's always worthwhile to sort of look beyond what is necessarily the most obvious thing, right? So obviously, the clear way to compare it is just like, well, what was going on 4 years ago? Because we know that crypto has a cyclical component to it that has been fairly predictable with some slight deviations. So naturally, it makes sense to look 4 years ago and say, all right, well, it seems like we could just simply be repeating where we were 4 years ago. There's also another idea. We could be here, right, in July of 2020, where it also went up to around the same risk level. And so I want you to keep, a couple of different views in mind. I find if you marry a single idea, then you're going to be disappointed because more than likely, whatever your idea is, Ada's not going to follow it, right? And I think a lot of people make that mistake. They get in their head what has to happen, and then when it doesn't happen, then they get upset. If you have a couple of ideas in your mind, then it helps you to sort of hedge for a couple of different outcomes. That way, no matter what the outcome, you're at least somewhat prepared for it. So there's a lot of similarities between this cycle for ADA and last cycle for ADA. A lot of it actually comes just first looking at the ADA USD chart. We talked a lot about this pattern right here, that pattern right there. And I mentioned that it looked like ADA was repeating that same pattern in 2023. You see that? Very similar pattern in 2023. In fact, if you take a bar pattern onto the chart and just more or less overlay this to that and just sort of shrink it down, you can see it's almost a carbon copy, right? Now, back over here in September of 2023, I was very bold in proclaiming that ADA Bitcoin would in fact go lower. And it was met with a lot of criticism, especially considering that at the time ADA was around 800 sats. And then it then rallied up to around 1600 sats. And and it really, one of the reasons why I struggled to really be optimistic about ADA Bitcoin over here was I just have this general idea that altcoins tend to be oscillators at best, and therefore they should eventually return back down to their range lows. So in 2023, when I was looking at it, it just didn't really make a whole lot of sense that 800 sats was the bottom. Now, I did a video about it, and I mean, if you go look at my interviews on other channels, I basically got torn apart, right, to suggest that ADA would ever go to 400 sats. And one of the reasons that people sort of pointed out was, well, it was going to hold this trend line, right? And it clearly didn't do that. It did eventually break down. It just took until March of 2024 to actually see that breakdown take place, right? But when it was October of 2023 and I started to see that rally, it kind of became obvious that I was going to have to wait a few months for it to ultimately play out. And, when you're sort of putting out these predictions and you kind of know in the back of your mind it's probably going to eventually play out, but it's not really worth, I've sort of learned it's not really worth sort of fighting people tooth and nail on it every single day. But again, you can see that eventually it did break down, and it did go to around 400 sats. So one of the things, though, that is interesting is if you look at ADA Bitcoin now, you could argue it's in one of potentially two places, right? I mean, it's potentially just in, this rally right here. And you could argue that there are a lot of similarities, right? You can see that it more or less bottomed at the same level. You could also make the case that it's here in July of 2020, right? Where it sort of rallied up to around the same level. Again, it's not entirely clear exactly which one it is, but you can see that ADA Bitcoin also had a rally starting at around, 400 sats, and it ultimately went up here to around 1500 sats before then coming back down. So it's definitely an interesting comparison to make. Now, the thing that I want to draw your attention to with ADA, going back to this pattern over here, one of the reasons why I had trouble sort of reconciling this move here with this one was because ADA Bitcoin hadn't gone to 400 sats, which is where I ultimately thought it was going to go. And what's really fascinating is we repeated that same pattern the next year, right? We repeated the same pattern the next year. And it looks, again, it's basically the same thing, right? I mean, you basically get a rally and you put in your first top, and then you get a pullback, and then you put in a slightly higher high, and then you get a deeper pullback. You see it? I mean, it's basically the same thing. In fact, this here, right? This here in 2023 looks a lot more similar to what happened in 2019, doesn't it? Or sorry, 2024. What happened in late 2023, early 2024 looks a lot more similar to what happened in 2019. And through the lens of monetary policy, you can appreciate it, right? If you overlay interest rates onto the chart, you'll see what I'm talking about, right? This first top here that occurred in April of 2019 occurred about halfway through the Fed pause on interest rates. And the second top occurred just before the Fed cut rates. You can kind of see the same thing, right? The first one was in the middle of the pause. The second one was kind of still in the middle, but just, before the Fed cut rates. And then as the Fed cut rates, you saw ADA USD drop down. Same thing, right? Fed cut rates, and then ADA USD dropped down. Then what happened is you started to get an aggressive rally, right? You see that aggressive rally that started in January of the halving year? You could argue that that's where we are, right? It's similar to that rally and not this one. And that's why I want everyone to keep in mind that it's important to be prepared for various outcomes, right? You have to be prepared for various outcomes, guys. I mean, I own, I obviously run some stake pools for Cardano. A lot of you guys, know about that. Some of you guys are staked with me. If you're not staked with me, you could, but I would also actually encourage you to support some of the smaller pools out there. I think that would be a better way to actually, sort of support the network, would be to go out and support the smaller pools rather than my own, if I'm being completely honest, right? I mean, I think that'd be a better way. But in this case, I have to think critically about this, right? I can't be blinded by, by what I want to happen or what I feel like, has to happen because it's been so long, right? Because everyone told me, everyone who told me that I was wrong about 400 sats, I knew if I should have, it made sense to me, and people just weren't patient. But it did eventually happen. And that's why when Bitcoin dominance hit 60%, I put out a video saying I was taking my maxi hat off, and it made sense to diversify into altcoins. Now, there's a few things we have to talk about, right? And it goes beyond ADA to some degree, right? But because the topic goes beyond ADA doesn't mean that ADA is not concerned. It's a part. ADA makes up a part of what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But in this case, right, as far as ADA is concerned, I look at it and I'm like, all right, well, it kind of seems like you could connect the lows, maybe a little bit of a fake out right here in September of 2023. But it also kind of seems like you could connect the highs, right? Very similar thing over here, right? I mean, it sort of seems like you could connect the lows. I'm kind of doing that in a weird way. Maybe I should connect it there. I'm not really trying to make a clear and obvious point to where I'm drawing these lows, right? I mean, you can see there's a big fake out when there was a recession, but you can also connect the highs. You see that? So you see it actually is a very familiar pattern, right? What essentially happened last year was what happened in 2023, everyone thought that we were already here or here and that we were going to rally up and do that. But we weren't, right? And the reason we weren't was because ADA Bitcoin hadn't gone to 400 sats. Okay? This time, this to me looks a lot more similar to this, primarily because ADA Bitcoin went back down to where it was last cycle, right around 400 sats. So then I look to say, well, okay, if this is where we are, right here, then what if this is where we are, right there? Again, I don't know. It's possible that ADA just breaks through, but I did tell people on ITC Premium a few weeks ago that, my target in the short term was going to be about a little over 120, right? A little over 120. And the reason I came up with 120 was because 120 basically was connecting these dots, A, B, C, and D, and E, right? And also, if you guys remember from last cycle, 120 was an area that ADA spent a lot of time at. It just seemed to be around 120 for a really long period of time, right? A really long period of time. And I remember that, and I just remember thinking like, well, if you do connect the dots, that's where it would eventually go, right? It would go up to around 120, a little bit north of 120. It actually, I think I said like 126 or 127, but you can actually see it. It went higher, went all the way up to like 133. So I do wonder if that is kind of what we're looking at here. Now, for a minute, let's suppose it is. Maybe for a minute, let's suppose it's not. Okay, if we suppose it's not, then the confirmation that it's not would be, really getting above 130, 140. Let's say 140. Like, if it's at 140, 150, you're pretty clearly breaking out of this trend here. And remember, if you break out of it, then that can lead to a whole different ballgame. And I'm not going to say it can't happen. Okay, it could. But what if it's July of 2020, right? What if it's July of 2020? Well, if that's the case and there's a pullback, it implies there's got to be a pullback somewhere else. Now, I don't know if there's going to be a pullback by Bitcoin or not. I do think you'll probably get a pullback by Bitcoin, January at the latest. But that's still a month away. You could have one sooner. It kind of depends on where the unemployment rate comes in on Friday. If the unemployment rate comes in low, then perhaps Bitcoin will still do okay. If it comes in high, then yeah, you could get a pullback by Bitcoin. But if it does pull back, where did it pull back to last cycle? Where what you'll notice is that it actually pulled back. I mean, if you don't look at the wick, because no one's going to buy the wick anyways, except for maybe like one person, and it's not you. And it's not me either. It basically retraced to the high from the prior move. You see that? Now, if you look here, you can kind of see the same thing happen last year, where the retrace from this top basically took you back to the high from the prior move. You see that? Look at all this. Imagine someone just like turns on the video and they look at this. I'm like, what the hell is he looking at here? Why don't we clean this up? So what you'll notice is that the pullback by ADA USD after that top was basically the prior highs, just like the pullback here were these prior highs. So it sort of raises the question, well, if it is similar to July of 2020 and there is a pullback, right? You connect these dots. Maybe you just ignore these over here and then you just connect these. But the great thing about it is you don't even have to ignore these. You can just extend this through and see that it also connects to those as well. So that's kind of interesting, right? So if there is a pullback, then maybe the pullback level would be around, somewhere around these prior highs. I don't know exactly where. I mean, obviously this one wicked lower, just like this one wicked lower. So, I mean, it could go back down even further, right? That's always a chance. But I imagine that if there is a pullback by ADA, within the next few weeks, that would be kind of the level to look at, because that was the same level that it bounced at last year, and it was also the same level that it bounced at in here, right? It's sort of going back to those prior highs. Now, I don't know if that pullback is going to occur, so please get off my back. I don't really care if it does. I mean, I said that at 60% dominance, it made sense to diversify. Okay. And ADA has gone up, several 100% since then, right? And I also said for years it was going to go to 400 sats, and it felt like no one believed me. But here we are, and I look at the chart, I'm like, well, it could happen. It could happen. Now, there is sort of, I guess, the elephant in the room, right? Where, when you look at this chart, I guess the elephant in the room is, what happens if it somehow still can't break out, right? I mean, there's always a chance it just doesn't break out, even though it feels like it should, I mean, last cycle when it finally broke out, it was essentially January of 2021. So, I mean, that would potentially give you time to come back down and then go back up. And that would correspond to next month, right? But you could also argue that if, the halving last cycle occurred, a month or so earlier, so maybe it's, maybe we're already right here. The thing about this that sucks, you can do mental gymnastics constantly, try to figure out where you are, which is why you shouldn't use this type of stuff to decide what you're going to do. I just stick to the risk metric. Well, that's not true with altcoins, right? It's true with, with Bitcoin. With altcoins, I do stick to the risk metric, but I also pretend like they don't exist when I'm pretty sure we're in a Bitcoin dominance uptrend, you know? Now, it's true, it's possible that the dominance of Bitcoin hasn't topped, right? There's always a chance, but 60% was good enough for me. And I would argue that if Bitcoin dominance is going to go up, then it would probably do it, you know, sometime within the next couple of months if it's gonna go back up. Um, but there is one thing that is kind of difficult, and it's I made a whole video on it, right? It was Bitcoin dominance when I was sort of addressing the elephant in the room, and essentially what I was saying was that it makes sense to diversify into alts because dominance went to 60%. And that was my target all along, was 60%. Hell, if you guys hadn't fought it so long, maybe we would have hit 60% a lot sooner. And you see what happened after 60% got hit, right? A massive drop by dominance. So it's kind of an interesting thing, right? I mean, it hit 60 and then you get a big drop. What's not to like about that? Especially if you did diversify into altcoins. Well, there's something that I've thought a lot about this cycle, and this is what really made me sort of pivot at 60% Bitcoin dominance, was to say there's a difference between being right and making money, right? There's actually a difference, and it feels like there's not, but there actually is. And what I mean by that was when we were sitting at 60% dominance, I was like, this was the target all along, right? 60% dominance. ADA's at 400 sats. ETH Bitcoin's between 0.03 to 0.04. It feels like I've been saying these levels for the last 3 years. And now it's finally here. So it made sense to diversify, right? It made sense to diversify. But there's still this part of me that wonders about one more thing. And that one more thing is not an investing strategy. It's not. I want to be clear about that. And the reason it's not an investing strategy is because ADA just went up several 100%, right? I mean, again, it made sense to diversify. So what if Bitcoin dominance eventually goes higher? So what? Who cares, right? I mean, if you still made money on the move, why does it matter if in a year dominance eventually goes higher? Which it might not, right? It might not. I mean, it's possible that the top's in at 60%. I mean, that was always my target. And I felt like asking for too much more would be greedy. But I'll tell you the one thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And it's basically this, right? It's basically this. Do you guys remember last year when, and here's the thing, you need to remember, altcoins bottom at different times against Bitcoin. Okay, they do. They don't all bottom at the same time. So what I'm about to say could happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that ADA Bitcoin has to ever go that much lower. It's possible that it could, but and look, like Sol Bitcoin is a good example of this, right? Like Sol Bitcoin bottomed out over here, right? It didn't need Bitcoin dominance to top for Sol Bitcoin to find a bottom, like a double bottom. You see that? It didn't need Bitcoin dominance to top in order for that to happen. But there's part of me that wonders, last year when ADA was at 400 sats, or sorry, 800 sats, when it was at 800 sats, and I said it was going to go to 400, and it then went up, it ripped me a new one, right? And I had to deal with the ADA maxis for a few months, but I hope I'm on better terms with them now. And then eventually it cooler heads prevailed, and it came back down. Now, I'll tell you one thing. The reason why I was so confident that this was just not going to lead anywhere was 2 reasons. First of all, well, 3 reasons. Bitcoin dominance was not at 60, which now it is, or it was For, you guys remember that time dominance went to 60%? Good times. That was one. Second reason, we hadn't started rate cuts yet, right? And if you overlay rate cuts, you'll see that, by the time that ADA Bitcoin really got moving last cycle, it was after rate cuts began. And so that's why I'm wondering, like, what if we're just in that move, It's because, this is where rate cuts began. So what if that's where we are? So then I was looking at it and I'm like, well, that's two reasons to believe that 800 sats wasn't the bottom, right? Two reasons to believe. The third reason to believe that 800 sats wasn't the bottom hasn't actually changed yet. And what that is total assets held by the Federal Reserve. This is something that hadn't actually bottomed last year. And so I wasn't willing to say that 800 sats was the bottom, because QT was still going on. Now, here's the thing. Okay? Technically speaking, ADA Bitcoin last cycle bottomed 1 month before QE began. Now, a lot of altcoins didn't bottom. ETH Bitcoin didn't bottom until QE began. It took an extra month. But ADA Bitcoin actually bottomed in August of 2019. QE didn't begin until September. So there is a reality that what if QE begins at the next Fed meeting, right? If QE begins at the next Fed meeting, then maybe ADA Bitcoin just bottomed 1 month before that. We'll find out in a couple of weeks. I believe it's December 18th. By the way, for those waiting for December 18th to figure out what's what and who's who with interest rates, I'll tell you this. I think a lot of people are going to be looking at what the Fed's going to do on December 18th. I don't think that's where you should be looking. I think a lot of people already know what the Fed's going to do. They're more than likely going to just cut rates by 25 basis points. I could be wrong, but that's probably what they're going to do. Where you should be looking is the Bank of Japan, because, they've really struggled recently. The yen has been struggling, and they likely need to start raising rates, because in order to strengthen the yen and to start fighting inflation over there. Because back when when the rest of the world was fighting inflation by raising rates, Japan wasn't doing a damn thing. And now they're starting to deal with inflation over there, and now they're starting to have to raise rates. Now, the reason I bring that up is because if you look at ADA USD, what is this, right? What am I looking at here? Just a bunch of jumbled lines, right? But if you look at ADA USD, you'll see that there were two drops here, one in April and one in August. So if you do get, sort of a drop in December, what could cause it? Well, one of the things that could cause it, which is no guarantee, so get off my back, Japanese interest rates. What the hell is Ben talking about now? Well, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this. The last two times that the Bank of Japan raised rates, the last time was in March, and then ADA USD kind of struggled just before that, right? And then they raised rates in July, and then you can see that ADA, then sort of sold off after that. So what's causing those sell-offs? Well, you could argue that it's the unwind of the carry trade. So what a lot of people do is, because interest rates over in Japan are so low, the cost of capital is cheaper. So you're going over there to get cheaper money, because it can get it over there a lot cheaper than get it over here in the States. But when the Bank of Japan raises rates, then that carry trade gets partially unwound. Now, it's not just them raising rates, right? Like, if the market is efficient, right? The market can look ahead and say, all right, well, if the Fed cuts rates 25 basis points, and if the Bank of Japan raises rates 25 basis points, the market should be able to work that out before it actually happens. But that's not what caused the sell-off in August. What caused the sell-off in August, arguably, was, well, we're looking for a narrative. There doesn't need to be a narrative. Narrative follows price. But if we were to make up a narrative for it, what happened was that the Somme rule recession indicator got triggered, and you didn't just get one rate cut priced in by the Fed. You got all these rate cuts priced in. So you're basically pricing in all these rate cuts by the Fed while the Bank of Japan was experiencing some inflation concerns. So you're starting to get the opposite for Japan, right? You were expecting rate hikes. So it was sort of like a double whammy where the Fed was hiking rates, the Fed was cutting rates and the Bank of Japan was raising rates. Therefore, that was the unwind of the carry trade. So that could be the narrative. And by the way, they also meet on December 18th. So just keep in mind December 18th, if there is a pullback in the market by ADA, then maybe that's what you should look for. And it might just look something like that. Where was I? I don't even know how I got on this stuff. But I'll tell you, I'll tell you one of the things that at least I'm thinking about. And it's basically, and again, I say this because not all alts bottom at the same time against Bitcoin, right? And I'll show the example again, right? Sol Bitcoin bottomed in 2023. So just because ADA Bitcoin was going lower, Sol Bitcoin wasn't, right? It bottomed out over here. One of the reasons I think it bottomed out a lot earlier was because it sold off more aggressively than everything else. If you look at Sol Bitcoin in 2021, you can see that it dropped about 90%. But if you look at ADA Bitcoin until, the end of 2022, it was only down 76%, right? But now it's already dropped 92%. So you see what I'm saying, right? That's one of the reasons why you could argue that Sol Bitcoin got that rally, and then eventually it actually came back down. Now, when Sol Bitcoin rallied, it rallied about 150% from that low. I believe ADA Bitcoin has rallied up more than that from its current low. Let me double check, but I'm pretty sure it has. I mean, it must have. Yeah, about 190%. So I guess it's not that much different. But one thing I want you to keep in mind, okay? And it again, being right is different than making money. Pause the video and say that to yourself, right? Being right is different than making money. And that's why when dominance hit 60%, and I was right, there was part of me that just wanted to keep the maxi hat on, but I forced myself to say no, right? It's being too greedy. It makes sense to take the maxi hat off. It makes sense to diversify. It doesn't matter if it eventually changes. But if you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, there's this thing that I wonder, because it's sort of like the same thing of ADA Bitcoin last year, right? Where last year, ADA Bitcoin went to 800 sats, and I was thinking, how can that be the bottom, right? How doesn't make sense? We haven't even had rate cuts yet. Alts are oscillators at best. How could that be the bottom? It wasn't. But you couldn't convince people of that back then. Today, I think you make the same argument for the collective altcoin market against Bitcoin. Again, ADA, it's doing something on its own, right? Every individual alt can deviate from the trend. They don't all have to bottom at the same time. But I look at a chart like this, right? And I just wonder, and I'm sure there's at least a little part of you that deep down potentially you agree with me, that I look at it and I'm like, well, is there a chance that the collective alt market is just doing what ADA Bitcoin did last year, where it seems like this is the low, but then we look, in a year, it just ends up dropping down again? Is that possible? I don't know. We've seen rallies like this before. If you look at total 3 divided by Bitcoin, and you don't subtract out the USDT, and you just sort of look at this low right here, it's not like we've never bounced off of these levels, So I guess I wonder if something like that is going to pan out, where it eventually goes back down. But here's the thing, right? I mean, and again, this is why it made sense to diversify, was, you got to trade the markets you have. And if dominance is at 60 and ADA Bitcoin went to the target, 400 sats, more or less, 470, 400, ETH Bitcoin's between 0.03 to 0.04, sometimes you just have to seize the opportunity when it happens. Even if everything else doesn't line up exactly how you want it to line up. So that's why I would say there's a difference between being right and making money. I mean, in this case, I was right about a few things, but there's other elements of it where I look at the chart and I'm like, well, technically speaking, we haven't had QE yet, and I don't know if we're gonna get it. I mean, maybe the Fed will give it to us next month, but there's not any guarantee yet that they will. I guess the other elephant in the room is that last cycle there was this pandemic-induced recession. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to get that, but what I am suggesting is that you always have to keep that in mind, right? There's no guarantee that the breakout occurs. You hope the breakout occurs, just like it occurred last cycle around this time, right? There's no guarantee. I actually looked this up because I was curious. This pattern is called, I guess, an ascending broadening wedge. I guess if you sort of draw it out like this. It's an ascending broadening wedge. And it's, I guess, studied over in mostly in Forex markets, currency markets. And last cycle, you could argue we also had one, right? Sort of an ascending broadening wedge. We obviously had sort of a fake out down here. But about 50, I think it was 52% of the time, they actually break down, right? They actually break down and not up. So that means, like 48% of the time, I think they obviously break up. And last cycle, it did break up, but it also first broke down. Maybe you argue that it broke down right there. I don't know. But just something to keep in mind if it can't get through. One of the things that I think happens when you get these ascending, broadening wedges is that basically what happens is that, ADA comes down here and you have the macro, right? The macro telling you, oh, this is bad, right? It's really bad. But you just run out of sellers and, the market needs a reason to go down, not up. And if you don't get the bad data, the market goes up, right? But, then if the market looks around, they're like, well, it's now April. We still don't have QE. We still don't have rate cuts. This was in 2023. So then it basically, ADA ran out of buyers. So then it came back down to the lows. And then down here, same thing, right? When are the rate cuts going to happen? When is QE going to start? When is all that going to happen? But eventually it just ran out of sellers and it went back up to the highs. And then you get all these people buying it again, and then it still couldn't break out. So then eventually it just goes back down to the lows. And down here, you could argue that it was looking at the unemployment rate, right? It was, looking at this as the unemployment rate was going up, and that was when ADA USD was going down. And then as the unemployment rate went down / sideways, that was when ADA bottomed and then started going back up. Remember, it needs a reason to go down, not a reason to go not a reason to go up. So now we're kind of back at the upside of the wedge, right? We're back to the upside. Where now we're trying to figure out, are there enough buyers to push it through this time? And what you'll notice is that the last couple of times it got up here, it first came up, put in a high at some point, and then it then went a little bit higher about 2 months later. last year, essentially did the same thing, except it was 3 months later. So I just wonder, I mean, if there is a pullback and then it goes back up, how do we know if it actually breaks out or not? Right? How do we know if it breaks out? My guess is that in order for it to really break out, you need an unemployment rate that's going down or sideways, right? Because this went up. Look at it like this. The unemployment rate has continued to go up. Now, assets like Bitcoin have been able to put in new all-time highs. I hate to break it to you. I don't even know why I say that. I'm not even going to say it. But assets like Bitcoin have already put in new all-time highs. This is not new, right? And this is what always happens. Basically, every cycle, the altcoin market takes longer to put in new all-time highs. But if you look at this, you can see that the unemployment rate has been generally going higher. And as it's been going higher, ADA-USD continues to struggle to actually break out. And that's why, and you can see that ADA Bitcoin has struggled up until very recently. So if ADA-USD is going to break out, then it would imply that the unemployment rate starts to go back down. Now we're going to get an unemployment rate print in, just a couple of days. So we'll see where it comes in. My guess is if it comes in low, you're more likely going to see things like Bitcoin do well. If it comes in high, then you could in fact get a correction. So, if the unemployment rate comes in higher, then you might see ADA-USD get that very correction that we've talked about, where it sort of comes back down and retests those prior highs. If the unemployment rate comes in low, then maybe it just breaks on through. So, that's kind of where I am with this whole ADA-USD argument, is that show me something new, right? One of the reasons I like ADA, and I like analyzing it, is because it tends to behave a lot better than a lot of other alt. Like it tends to be, in my mind, it tends to be a bit more predictable for some reason. Right? I don't know. I just think it follows the collective market a little bit closer than like other individual random alts, right? And it's been around for a couple of cycles, right? I mean, it was in the 2017 cycle, was in the 2021 cycle. Now we're in 2024, right? It's been around. I mean, it's not number one or number two, and it's probably not going to be, but it's at least been around. So, I look at this and I'm like, well, if it's going to break out, it probably implies the unemployment rate goes down. If the unemployment rate goes up, then you're probably going to see it get rejected. Okay. Now, there does always exist a scenario where it eventually comes back down to this trend line again. And what's really interesting about it is that, the last time it hit this trend line was in, Q3 2023. Then it hit it in Q3 of 2024. I don't know if it's going to happen again in 2025. It seems like it's a bit much to ask for, but I guess it really just depends on how the labor market holds up. And I'm not telling you this because I expect it to make me any friends. I'm just saying, guys, I mean, I do have some, and I want to look at what the risks are. And those are what the risks are. Now, if you look at, you go back and look at ADA Bitcoin, you look at it like this, I mean, I guess the thing is you can see last cycle, it really took its time to sort of, and it really did form a bottom that lasted as a bottom for a long time. I think the counterpoint, though, is sometimes you sort of get time-based capitulation. But I guess the argument is like, well, from a linear perspective, nothing has really changed, right? I mean, all these have just been lower highs so far. But it does feel a little different this time because dominance has hit 60. There are some alts that are taking out their December 2023 highs on their Bitcoin pairs, right? There's some of them are. So, I would at least keep that in mind. The other thing that's interesting is the ADA ETH pair. So if you look at ADA ETH, you can see that last cycle, it basically did this pattern where it, was putting in some higher highs, was putting in some lower lows, right? And you can kind of see, at least recently, it's been kind of doing something similar where it's been putting in some higher highs, it's been putting in some lower lows. And if you look at it like this, then maybe this is sort of your first tag of the trend line, first tag there, and then maybe this is your second tag, and then that's your second tag, and then this is your third tag, and maybe that's where we currently are. ADA ETH is at the third tag of the trend line. But what's really fascinating about that is that the third tag of the trend line is here, and there is July of 2020, which is really interesting because if you look at ADA USD and you say overlay this here and connect it there, that peak here corresponds to this peak. But it's happening earlier this time, just lining it up from when that top occurred. It's happening earlier because we didn't have that, right? We didn't have this. So yeah, it does seem like there's some validity to that argument, right? Sort of that July of 2020 argument. And we'll see what happens. I guess, again, the elephant in the room is that, we still have an inverted yield curve. We're going to have to deal with that at some point. I don't know when it's going to be, but we're going to and by the way, if you look at interest rates by the US and you subtract out Japanese interest rates, it's kind of an interesting story, right? I mean, you can kind of see the how the cycles play out, right? So just something to keep in mind. On some more positive notes, if you go look at Cardano, right? If you go over to the asset filter over here, you look at ADA, and then you go look at some of the on-chain stuff like address creation. There's definitely been an uptick in activity, right? I mean, if you go back to a linear scale, and you can see recently that it's starting to pick up a little bit. So that's always a good thing to see. If you look at address count statistics for ADA, you can see that. Let me sort of group this by between, say, I don't know, 1,000 to 10,000 ADA. Well, it's actually been going down recently. Let's group it by 10,000 to 100,000. It's been dropping a little bit. So I guess that implies that, some people are at least taking profits. I guess you could probably see it in the HODL waves, right? So if you go look at the HODL waves for Cardano and you just look at long-term holders, yeah, you can see that it's starting to drop a little bit, right? See, this is where I say these things and people are like, oh, how dare he say something like that? I'm like, well, guys, just look at the chart, right? I mean, don't get mad at me. Just in October, long-term holders, people holding ADA for at least 6 months. A lot of you guys are going to be like, that's not long-term, but let's just bear with me for a second. Long-term, at least 6 months, was around almost 54%. Today, it's 49%. So some of you guys are selling, right? I don't know, it's probably not you. I'm talking about the other person. If you exclude 6 months to 1 year and you just look at anything above 1 year, you can see it has been dropping, right? It was at around 39 almost, and then now it's at 36. So there are certainly some people that are offloading a little bit here. And the reverse is also true, right? If you look at short-term holders, it's been going up recently. So essentially what you're seeing is that people who, and you can kind of see the same thing happen previously, right? But the people that accumulated ADA over here are offloading it to some degree up here to shorter term holders. Now, that doesn't mean that ADA can't go up, but it just means that people who bought it at, say, 20 cents or 30 cents, some of them are taking profits and they're selling it to the people coming in today for a nice, 3 to 4x move. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's how the market works. If we were to go look at transfer volume for ADA, let's see where that's coming in. You can see that there's a nice spike here recently, right? There's also a spike going into that top in December of 2023, that sort of that local top. So I'd keep an eye on that. We could look at something else, I guess. I don't know. I'm just sort of looking through this. Valuation. What's the MVRV Z-score on ADA? Okay, so it's moved up here. So in this case, it looks more similar to January of 2021 than July, right? Because July, the MVRVZ score was all the way back down at 0.112 for ADA. But today, it's all the way up at 1.15. So that is a way to look at the market, and it tells you something different. If you look at the net unrealized profit and loss, it's this orange line, right? This orange line. If we look at network value to transaction value, it's gone up a little bit each time. Well, maybe it was a lower here, now it's a little bit higher. If we look at transaction fees, it's gone up, right? It's gone up quite a bit recently. You know what's really interesting about transaction fees is you can see it's gone up a lot recently for ADA, but you're not really seeing that reflected with Bitcoin, right? If you look at Bitcoin, I mean, transaction fees aren't really going anywhere, which is really different for ADA. And I mean, I don't know what other chains are doing. ETH is, it's moved a little bit, but yeah, I mean, Cardano transaction fees have soared recently. Open interest in volume, open interest of crypto futures for Cardano, ADA futures open interest. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely exploded recently. So I hope this gives you some perspective on the market. And look, guys, I'm not, I've been the bad guy in the past by saying it was going to go to 400 sats. I don't want to be the bad guy. I just want to tell you guys my thoughts on the market and kind of recognize that it's not about being right. It really isn't. It's not about being, it's not even about it going to 400 sats, right? It's just about, how do you look at the market and figure out what are some likely outcomes to be prepared for? And if those outcomes come true, then at least you are prepared for it. At the end of the day, being right means nothing. It means nothing. We're here to make money. Okay, let's not kid ourselves. You're here to make money. You're not here to be right. And I've said this many, many times. I'd rather be rich and wrong than poor and right. It's better to put your dignity aside sometimes, right? Your pride, maybe not your dignity. Keep your dignity. I'm going to say pride. It's better to put your pride aside sometimes and make money than to hold on to your pride and be right, right? Now, I did that, right? I mean, I did that for ADA Bitcoin to 400 sats, and I did it for Bitcoin dominance to 60%, and I did it for ETH Bitcoin to 0.03 to 0.04, right? I held on to it. I held on to it for, for dear life, being like, this is going to happen. I don't care what the haters say. And I feel like I got lucky, honestly, that it actually panned out. And I'm always going to tell you guys my hesitations with altcoins because you guys know what happens in Bitcoin dominance uptrends, right? You've seen it happen. A lot of people thought there was no way in hell ADA was going to go to 400 sats and then went to 470. So I will not sort of back down from those views. in the future. But I just want people to know, and I hope you learned your lesson, that is how the market works, right? Alts bleed to Bitcoin. It has nothing to do with your altcoin. It's just the way the market works during higher interest rates and quantitative tightening. We've started to get lower interest rates, and altcoins, some of the altcoin market has started to wake up. ADA has gone up a lot recently. I hope a lot of people are doing well with it. The only thing that gives me hesitation is not really necessarily specifically for ADA, because ADA has gone more or less to the target of 400 sats. It's more so the other, the altcoin market as a whole. I just wonder, is it just like last year where in a year it's going to be like, yeah, it still did eventually go down. It's just that everyone was too impatient to see it happen. I don't know, right? I'm like, is that going to happen? I don't know. You can see this one just took forever for it to play out. And I don't know. I don't know if it's gonna get rejected here or if it'll just go higher. I just know that historically altcoins are oscillators at best, and ADA essentially proved that because it went to 400 sats, which is where it went last cycle. So there's part of me that thinks, well, if ADA went to where it was last cycle, 400 sats, then why won't the collective altcoin market eventually go to its range low, right? That's what is puzzling to me. But again, this is not an investing strategy, right? It was good, and as long as it lasted. It was good to see it go to 60% Bitcoin dominance. It was good to see ADA Bitcoin go to 400 sats. I'm not asking you to look at this chart and hold on to it for dear life forever. I'm just saying, there's a chance that you look back on it in a couple of years and the eventual outcome was that it went to the range lows. But that doesn't mean you can't make money on it as it goes to the range lows. ADA's up several 100% in the last few weeks. So that's essentially what I mean. And by the way, if you look at alt Bitcoin pairs and you overlay net liquidity onto the chart, one of the things you'll notice is it generally tracks, right? When net liquidity is dropping, when central bank net liquidity is dropping, all Bitcoin pairs are usually dropping, right? But there has been occasional times where you can see that all Bitcoin pairs go up as net liquidity goes down. So sometimes they diverge, but then they eventually return back to where they should be. And you've kind of seen something like that happen again, right? Where alt Bitcoin pairs are going up and net liquidity has generally been trending down. One of the reasons net liquidity has been going down is because the dollar has been going up. And I do think the dollar is likely going to get one more rally into the end of the year. And if you look at it on the daily, if it's going to bounce, I said this on Twitter or X, where I was like, it's going to bounce here. And it's at least started that bounce. It's probably going to wait for more labor market data to come in to decide. But anyways, guys, I don't really have anything else to say about it. I just think that, it was good to see ADA go to 400 sats. It was good to see Bitcoin dominance go to 60%. And it was good to start hedging. Do the altcoins eventually go to the range lows? Or the collective altcoin market? Maybe. Right? Maybe. But, again, that's not necessarily an investing strategy. It's just it's just a thought, right? It's a theory that may or may not pan out. So, let's just sort of finalize this on the ADA USD chart. So for now, this is what ADA is dealing with, right? The sort of the expanding, broadening wedge that it's trying to break out of. And it had a very similar thing last cycle. Last cycle, it did eventually break out. And it did eventually break out in the post-halving year. So if it doesn't break out in December, there's still a good chance it breaks out sometime in the post-halving year. Does that mean it breaks out in January? Maybe, but not necessarily. We'll have to take it one step at a time. And that's kind of where I am right now. Like, we'll take it one step at a time. And there's always a chance that I just upload this video, put it live, and then ADA just breaks through tomorrow, right? Which again, I'm not, there were a couple indicators in there that we looked at that suggested that we could be a little bit further along, right? There's always a chance that we're further along. I think one of the things that we'll be telling is, what does the Fed do on December 18th, right? Do they actually start QE back up or do they not? And everyone's kind of getting a little bit overzealous with all Bitcoin pairs, maybe prematurely, but that doesn't mean you can't make money on them in the meantime. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.